The early morning sky above northern France was washed with pale light, a quiet contrast to the heavy hum of engines lined up along the Allied airfield. Rows of Republic P-47 Thunderbolts shimmered faintly beneath a thin mist, their broad wings and rugged frames glinting with dew. The aircraft were enormous by fighter standards, massive, heavily armored machines whose thick fuselage and radial engine could absorb punishment that would shatter lighter planes. The pilots who flew them had come to trust this strength with their lives. Among them that morning was Lieutenant Harold Hal Stevens of the 56th Fighter Group, 8th Air Force, one of the many American airmen stationed in England in the summer of 1944, weeks after D-Day. His mission briefing was simple but deadly: escort a formation of B-17 flying fortresses over occupied territory and strike ground targets of opportunity on the return leg. German resistance was expected, but after months of steady Allied advance, air superiority seemed to belong to the Americans. Still, Stevens knew that in war, complacency was a dangerous companion. The Luftwaffe might be dwindling, but the German pilots who remained were veterans, skilled, and desperate. By 9 o'clock hours, the squadron was airborne. 8 P-47s formed a loose diamond formation above the bomber stream, sunlight flashing off their silver skins. The deep roar of their Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines was almost orchestral, a thunderous mechanical heartbeat that vibrated through Stevens's seat. He looked to his right and saw his wingman, Lieutenant Brown, give a thumbs up. The altimeter needle hovered near 20,000 feet, the air cold and thin. Below, the French countryside rolled in slow patterns of green and brown. For nearly an hour, the mission was uneventful. The radio carried only routine check-ins and the occasional burst of static. Then, somewhere near Rouen, the first warning came, a clipped voice over the comms: "Bandits, 3 o'clock high." Stevens turned his head just as dark specks cut across the blue horizon. Moments later, sunlight glinted off their wings, Messerschmitt Bf-109s. The Thunderbolts tightened formation. The bombers began to weave slightly, their defensive guns swiveling like nervous eyes. The Germans dove fast, their slim silhouettes slicing through the air. The first burst of cannon fire flashed between the bomber and escort lines, followed by the sharp staccato of machine guns. Stevens rolled left, pulling hard on the stick, feeling the strain of gravity press against his chest. His Thunderbolt responded sluggishly but steadily, the heavy airframe handling the maneuver with solid confidence. He squeezed the trigger on the control yoke, and his 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns erupted in unison, each wing spitting a bright stream of tracer fire. The sky turned chaotic. A B-17 trailed smoke. A Messerschmitt exploded in a sudden orange blossom. The radio became a jumble of shouts, warnings, and call signs. Stevens locked onto a 109 that was diving toward the bombers. He followed it down, closing the distance rapidly. The enemy pilot twisted, banking sharply right, but the Thunderbolt's dive speed was unmatched. Stevens fired a burst, 1 second, 2, and saw metal fragments burst from the 109's fuselage. The German plane shuddered, rolled, and spiraled downward, disappearing into cloud. Then, without warning, Stevens's cockpit flared with light. Something slammed into the side of his aircraft, a cannon shell, maybe two. The left wing shook violently, and the cockpit filled with the acrid smell of burning oil. His warning panel lit up in red. The engine temperature climbed. He glanced out to see a jagged hole the size of a football in the wing root, smoke pouring from the damaged cylinder bank. The control stick felt heavier now, and every vibration carried the weight of the crippled plane. "Hal, you're smoking." Brown's voice came through the headset. "You're hit bad, bail out if you have to." But Stevens didn't answer. He knew they were still deep over enemy territory, too far to risk capture. He steadied the stick, reduced throttle slightly, and leveled off, hoping to nurse the wounded plane westward. The Thunderbolt's engine coughed, sputtered, then caught again, its radial design refusing to die easily. That was one of the aircraft's legendary traits, its sheer durability. Stories had spread through the airfields, pilots landing with holes through their wings, engines shot apart, even pieces of tail missing. Stevens now understood why those tales were told with reverence. He descended to 8,000 feet, losing altitude to keep speed without overtaxing the dying engine. The noise inside the cockpit was deafening, wind whistling through ruptured panels, the rhythmic clatter of the engines struggling for life. The gauges flickered erratically. Below him stretched a patchwork of fields, villages, and roads. He crossed the Seine, spotting the bombed-out bridges that marked the front line. Anti-aircraft fire erupted in black puffs around him, German flak batteries still active. Shrapnel rattled against the fuselage like hail. He tightened his harness and pressed on. Every minute felt like an hour. He thought about his training back in Florida, the instructor's mantra, "Trust your Jug, she'll bring you home." The P-47 had earned its nickname Jug for its stout shape and the way it handled punishment. Now that saying was no longer folklore, it was survival. After 40 minutes of tense flight, the coast came into view. The English Channel glimmered like liquid steel beneath the sun. Stevens's relief was short-lived. The oil pressure gauge dropped to near zero. The propeller's pitch wavered, and a thin trail of smoke followed his path. He radioed ahead, "Base, this is Thunderbolt Red 2, returning with damage, request emergency landing." The reply came faint but clear, "Copy, Red 2, runway is clear. Wind 240 at 10. He began descent, reducing power carefully. The landing gear refused to deploy. He toggled the emergency handle, felt a shudder beneath his feet, and saw one wheel lock into place, but not the other. There was no time to troubleshoot. With one wing burning and partial gear, he aimed for the grass beside the main strip. The ground rushed upward. Impact came with a violent jolt. Metal screamed, glass shattered, and the Thunderbolt slid across the field, kicking up dirt and smoke until it came to rest in a broken silence. For a long moment, Stevens sat motionless, hands still gripping the stick. His heart hammered in his chest. Then he unbuckled and climbed out through the shattered canopy. Ground crew were already running toward him. One of them stopped short, staring at the damage, half the left wing torn open, the tail peppered with holes, the engine cowling shredded. "Good God," the crew chief muttered. "How the hell did this thing stay in the air?" Stevens gave a faint smile, wiping oil from his face. "Because it's a Thunderbolt," he said quietly. In the days that followed, engineers examined the aircraft. It had taken direct hits from 20mm cannon shells, lost hydraulic pressure, and flown nearly 150 miles in that state. The official report credited the aircraft's radial engine and rugged construction for saving the pilot's life. Among mechanics and pilots alike, the story spread quickly, another testament to the P-47's unmatched toughness. Decades later, aviation historians would describe the Thunderbolt as one of the most durable fighters of the Second World War. Its air-cooled engine allowed it to survive damage that would destroy liquid-cooled planes like the P-51 Mustang or the Bf-109. Its thick armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks gave pilots a fighting chance to make it home even after catastrophic hits. In total, more than 15,000 Thunderbolts were built, serving in every major theater, from the skies over France to the jungles of Burma. The tale of Lieutenant Stevens, though just one among many, embodies the spirit of that machine and the men who flew it. They were not superheroes or legends, just young men in their 20s, caught in the vast machinery of war, trusting a few inches of steel and aluminum to carry them through fire and sky. The P-47 became more than an aircraft. It was a symbol of resilience, of engineering built not for elegance but endurance. When historians look back on the air war over Europe, they often focus on the glamorous dogfights or the strategic bombing campaigns. But behind those headlines were moments like this, solitary, unseen struggles between man, machine, and the elements. A pilot, alone in the sky, guiding a crippled plane home through flak and fear, listening to the heartbeat of an engine that refused to quit. And perhaps that, more than anything else, explains why the P-47 earned its lasting nickname, not just Jug, but the Jug that couldn't die. In the following days, Lieutenant Stevens's damaged P-47 became a sort of legend around the base. Mechanics from other squadrons came to see it, walking slowly around the ruined fuselage, tracing the paths of cannon shells that had torn through the metal skin. One shell had entered near the engine cowling and exited through the lower wing spar, narrowly missing the main fuel line. Another had ruptured part of the hydraulic system, leaving a trail of black residue along the belly. Yet somehow, the main structural beams had held. The thick skin of the Thunderbolt, made from high-tensile aluminum alloy, had absorbed shock that would have split thinner fighters apart. The engineering officer in charge of the inspection, Captain Michael Graves, wrote a report so detailed that it was later forwarded to the Republic Aviation Plant in Farmingdale, New York. He noted the aircraft's survival as a field test confirmation of design integrity under extreme combat stress. When the report reached the factory floor, assembly workers pinned copies to the notice boards. It was a reminder that their long hours of riveting, welding, and testing were not just industrial routine, they were acts of life preservation. The Thunderbolt had always been considered overbuilt, almost excessively so. Early in the war, pilots complained that it was too heavy, too sluggish to climb compared to the nimble German Messerschmitts or Focke-Wulfs. But as combat experience grew, so did respect. The massive air-cooled engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, was among the most reliable power plants ever designed. Unlike liquid-cooled engines, it could survive hits to its cylinders without catastrophic coolant loss. Even when a shell tore through the crankcase, as in Stevens's plane, the remaining cylinders could still produce enough power to limp home. Flight engineers later replicated the damage pattern on a test fuselage, firing 20mm rounds into mock sections to measure structural fatigue. The results surprised them. The thick, elliptical wing design distributed stress so evenly that even large holes failed to cause immediate collapse. In short, the P-47 was less a delicate bird and more a flying tank. As Stevens recovered, he was debriefed by intelligence officers who wanted every detail: the altitude, the type of shells, the engine behavior, how the controls responded. He recalled the strange steadiness of the plane, even after the impact. It felt alive, he told them. Not just flying on physics, but on something more. Like it wanted to make it back. He didn't mean it literally, of course, but his words captured something deeply human in the machine. By late 1944, the line between man and aircraft had blurred. Pilots spoke to their planes, stroked their noses before missions, and treated them as companions. The war had turned machines into extensions of the self, forged in the shared experience of fear and endurance. The 56 Fighter Group continued its missions, escorting bombers deep into Germany. Every sortie carried new risks: flak over the Ruhr, dogfights above the Rhine, icy fuel lines at high altitude. Yet the men trusted the P-47 to protect them. The aircraft's 8 Browning M2 machine guns, synchronized in symmetrical pairs, gave it devastating firepower. A full burst lasted only a few seconds but could deliver over 12 pounds of lead into a target, enough to shred enemy fighters or ground convoys. In one recorded engagement near Kassel, Stevens's squadron leader, Major Robert Keller, used the Thunderbolt's dive speed to attack a German armored column. From 10,000 feet, the planes descended nearly vertically, dropping 500-pound bombs and strafing with .50 caliber rounds. German gunners fired back, but most shells bounced harmlessly off the plane's thick underside armor. The official report described it as aerial artillery in motion, a term that suited the Thunderbolt's dual identity as both fighter and bomber. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, engineers at Republic Aviation continued refining the design. They introduced bubble canopies for greater visibility, added water injection to boost engine power, and experimented with dive brakes to stabilize the aircraft in near-supersonic descents. The Thunderbolt became not just a machine of war but a platform of innovation, pushing the boundaries of what piston-driven fighters could achieve before the jet age. By early 1945, Lieutenant Stevens had completed more than 80 combat missions. He was no longer the fresh-faced pilot who had arrived in England a year earlier. His hair had begun to grey at the temples, his voice quieter, his eyes older. The war had aged them all. Many of his friends had not returned, some lost to enemy fire, others to mechanical failure or bad weather. Each empty bunk was a silent reminder of how narrow the line between survival and loss could be. One cold morning in February, Stevens visited the wreck of his old Thunderbolt, now stripped for parts near the edge of the base. The wings were gone, the cockpit gutted, but the nose, still bearing the faded name Lucky Lady, remained. He stood there for a long time, gloved hand resting on the dented metal. The plane had been his partner, his shield, his last line of defense against the chaos of the world. When he finally walked away, he felt as though he were leaving behind a piece of himself. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, the surviving P-47s began to disappear from European skies. Some were shipped to the Pacific, others scrapped or sold for parts. But a few were preserved, their battle scars left untouched. One of them, the reconstructed fuselage of Stevens's Lucky Lady, was later displayed at a small aviation museum in Duxford. Visitors still stop to stare at the gaping holes along its wings, reading the placard that tells of a pilot who refused to abandon his crippled plane. In later interviews, Stevens rarely spoke about heroism. "I didn't feel brave," he once said. "I just wanted to get home. The plane did the rest." Historians who study the air war often return to stories like his as windows into a broader truth about technology and humanity. The P-47 was not elegant like the Spitfire or glamorous like the Mustang. It was loud, unwieldy, and brutally effective, a triumph of function over form. Its story mirrors that of the Allied war effort itself, imperfect, costly, but unstoppable. From an engineering standpoint, the Thunderbolt represented a pinnacle of piston engine evolution. Its massive R2800 engine generated over 2,500 horsepower, driving the plane to speeds exceeding 430 miles per hour. It could climb to 30,000 feet in under 8 minutes and dive faster than any aircraft of its time. But beyond numbers, it was a triumph of resilience, proof that survival was not just a matter of luck, but of design philosophy. Republic Aviation's engineers had built it with a single guiding principle: no pilot should die because his machine was fragile. Every rivet, every panel, every redundant system served that ideal. The Thunderbolt could fly with half its tail gone, or with a cylinder shot out, or with the canopy shattered. The engineers had not merely built a fighter, they had built a promise. After the war, many P-47 pilots carried that lesson into civilian life. Some became test pilots for the emerging jet age, others commercial aviators or engineers. Stevens joined a post-war research program at Wright Field, where he assisted in analyzing combat damage reports. His first-hand account helped shape the next generation of aircraft safety standards. "Durability," he wrote in one memo, "is not the opposite of performance. It is the foundation of trust." As jet engines replaced propellers and the sky filled with sleeker, faster machines, the Thunderbolt's era faded into history. Yet its legacy endured, in the A-10 Warthog's titanium armor, in the redundant hydraulic systems of modern fighters, in the very philosophy that a machine should protect the human it carries. In the end, the story of the P-47 Thunderbolt is not merely a chronicle of war but a parable of endurance, of how strength, patience, and design can overcome fragility and fear. When Lieutenant Stevens climbed out of his ruined aircraft that morning, oil-stained and trembling, he became part of that parable. His survival was not luck, it was the culmination of human ingenuity welded into aluminum, roaring against the odds. And though the sky that once echoed with the thunder of radial engines has long since grown quiet, the spirit of the Jug still hums faintly in every aircraft that dares to bring its pilots safely home. In the years that followed, aviation engineers and historians alike kept returning to the story of aircraft like Stevens's. It wasn't simply nostalgia that drew them back, it was a fascination with how a machine born from industrial pragmatism could develop such a human mythology. The P-47 Thunderbolt had not been designed for beauty. It had been designed to solve a problem: how to keep a man alive in the most hostile environment imaginable. At its core, the Thunderbolt was an engineering paradox. Its sheer size, over 8 tons fully loaded, should have made it clumsy. Yet pilots learned that once its great propeller spun and the turbocharger came to life, the aircraft transformed. The supercharger system, which fed compressed air to the Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine even at high altitudes, gave it an unexpected advantage over its sleeker rivals. German fighters often struggled above 25,000 feet, their engines gasping for oxygen. The P-47, by contrast, seemed to come alive in the thin air, roaring like a living creature as the turbo spun up behind the cockpit. When scientists at Wright Field analyzed the engine's thermal data after the war, they found something remarkable. Even after sustaining multiple hits to the cylinder block, the engine could maintain stable internal pressure thanks to redundant cooling fins and the air-cooled radial layout. In a liquid-cooled inline engine, a single puncture could drain coolant and seize the crankshaft within seconds. The Thunderbolt's radial design prevented such failures entirely. Its designers had sacrificed aerodynamic elegance for mechanical reliability, and that trade-off had saved countless lives. In one technical paper published in 1946, engineers noted that the P-47's combat survivability was nearly double that of earlier model P-51 Mustangs when sustaining equivalent damage. The report concluded, The energy absorption of distributed mass in the Thunderbolt contributes significantly to its crashworthiness and in-flight resilience. To a layman, it meant that the plane could take punishment, brute force turned into a kind of grace. Lieutenant Stevens, by then working as a consultant for the Air Materiel Command, found himself lecturing to young engineers who were designing jet fighters. He often told them stories that began not with blueprints but with men, pilots caught in storm clouds, listening to the groan of metal and the hiss of wind through bullet holes. Every number, he would say, tapping the chalkboard, means a heartbeat. Every equation is a life measured in seconds. What fascinated him most was not the machine itself but the dialogue between man and design. He described flying the P-47 as a negotiation. The pilot trusted the plane's strength, and the plane demanded respect for its mass. Its enormous inertia could be both ally and enemy. In a dive, the Thunderbolt gathered speed so quickly that only careful timing could prevent the wings from shearing off. Pilots learned to anticipate the aircraft's reactions, a rhythm, almost like dancing with something alive. Those who fought against it too harshly lost control. Those who learned to move with it survived. In modern terms, flight psychologists might call this the emergence of human-machine symbiosis, the moment when operator and system form an instinctive feedback loop. In the 1940s, there were no such words. There was only intuition and experience. Pilots knew when their plane was talking to them, when the vibrations changed pitch, when the stick grew heavy before a stall, when the sound of the engine shifted ever so slightly. The Thunderbolt was loud, yes, but beneath the noise lay information, a coded language of metal and air. Researchers at the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, the precursor to NASA, later studied this communication. They installed vibration sensors and strain gauges on surviving airframes to quantify the feedback that pilots had once felt through instinct. Their data revealed micro-oscillations that indeed provided tactile warnings before aerodynamic failure, a mechanical form of empathy. By the 1950s, when jets ruled the skies, the old Thunderbolts were being melted down or left to decay in forgotten hangars. But to those who had flown them, they remained unforgettable. Many veterans described dreams in which they could still hear the steady hum of the R-2800, the rhythmic thump of its 18 pistons. In one letter archived at the Smithsonian, a former pilot wrote, "Sometimes I wake up hearing the old engine again, and it feels like coming home." Psychologists who studied combat stress later found that such dreams were common among pilots who had survived heavy damage incidents. The sound of the engine had become a symbol of life, of continuity amid chaos. To hear it was to know one was still alive. The Thunderbolt, then, was not only a machine of war, it was also an instrument of reassurance, a heartbeat in metal form. Technologically, the aircraft embodied the industrial philosophy of its time: redundancy, robustness, and over-engineering as virtues. Its electrical system had duplicate circuits, its control lines were protected by steel tubing, even its fuel tanks were self-sealing, lined with rubber that swelled when hit by bullets to prevent leaks. In today's world of lightweight composites and fly-by-wire systems, such design might seem excessive. Yet in the brutal arithmetic of 1944, excess was survival. Aerodynamicists studying wartime data found that the Thunderbolt's thick wings, once criticized for drag, provided immense lift stability. This allowed it to recover from dives that would have torn thinner wings apart. Pilots exploited this strength to execute boom and zoom tactics, diving from high altitude at tremendous speed, firing, and then climbing back to safety before enemies could respond. In these moments, mass became momentum, and the aircraft's weight turned into its weapon. Stevens remembered one such mission vividly. Escorting bombers over France, his squadron was ambushed by Focke-Wulfs diving out of the sun. He rolled into a steep descent, felt the airframe shudder, and watched his altimeter spin downward. At 500 miles per hour, the stick trembled under his grip. He squeezed the trigger for a 2-second burst, and tracers streaked ahead, tearing through an enemy wing. Pulling out of the dive, the G-forces pressed him deep into the seat, vision narrowing to a grey tunnel. When the plane finally leveled, he could barely breathe. But the Thunderbolt held together. It always did. After the war, when Stevens visited Republic's engineers, he thanked them, not as a formality, but as a survivor acknowledging his debt. One of the designers, Alexander Kartveli, replied simply, "We built it strong because we knew you'd need it." Those words stayed with him for the rest of his life. In his later writings, Stevens often reflected on that philosophy. He saw in the Thunderbolt a symbol of resilience, an argument, made in metal, that endurance was as noble as speed or beauty. In one unpublished essay found after his death, he wrote, "Machines mirror their makers. The P-47 was not perfect, but neither were we. It was flawed, noisy, and stubborn. Yet it refused to quit. Perhaps that is why we trusted it so completely." As the decades passed, aviation historians began to see the P-47 not merely as an artifact but as a milestone in the evolution of design thinking. Its lessons resurfaced in the Cold War era, influencing the A-10 Thunderbolt II, the spiritual successor built around the same philosophy: survive the impossible, bring the pilot home. The circle was complete. From a scientific standpoint, the P-47 story encapsulates a transition in aeronautical engineering, from empirical craftsmanship to systems science. Wartime necessity forced engineers to test, iterate, and record every variable. They built wind tunnels to map drag curves, measured heat transfer across cowlings, and introduced statistical reliability models. The war accelerated the birth of modern aerospace science, and the Thunderbolt stood at the heart of that transformation. Even today, when aerospace students study structural fatigue or energy dissipation, they often encounter data derived from those early tests. A faded photograph of a battle-scarred P-47 sits in many textbooks, a reminder that progress is written not only in equations but also in endurance. In the twilight of his life, Stevens visited an airshow where a restored Thunderbolt performed a flypast. The sound hit him first, a deep, resonant growl that seemed to vibrate through his chest. As the plane banked overhead, sunlight glinting off polished aluminum, he felt tears blur his vision. Around him, children cheered, unaware that they were watching a ghost of an era when the sky decided everything. He stood quietly until the noise faded. Then, almost to himself, he whispered, "Still flying." And in that moment, it was true. The Thunderbolt was still flying, not only in the air, but in memory, in design, in the very DNA of every aircraft that values strength as much as speed. Years after the war had ended, Lieutenant Stevens's name appeared occasionally in academic papers and aviation magazines. To most readers, he was a footnote, a pilot who had survived extraordinary damage and lived to tell the tale. But among engineers, his flight was quietly legendary. It represented something fundamental about how human beings build trust in their machines. When Republic Aviation's post-war technical committee published its final report on the Thunderbolt's field performance, they included a section simply titled Operational Resilience under Combat Stress. The language was dry, bureaucratic, yet behind every line was a heartbeat. It described how multiple aircraft had returned home missing entire control surfaces, how redundant systems had preserved flight when main hydraulics failed, and how structural tolerances had exceeded theoretical limits by as much as 30%. The engineers admitted, with understated pride, that their model predictions had not fully accounted for the survivability factor inherent in the aircraft's distributed mass. That phrase, distributed mass *, would later become part of aerospace design vocabulary. It meant that the plane's weight and structure were spread so evenly that stress could flow through it like a pulse through veins, dissipating rather than concentrating at a single breaking point. Decades later, computer simulations would confirm what wartime experience had already proven by blood and fire. For historians of technology, the P-47 represented the culmination of an industrial philosophy that valued strength above elegance. It was, in every sense, a fortress of the air. Its thick fuselage, broad wings, and massive radial engine made it appear almost primitive next to the sleek forms of later jets. But its very excess became its genius. In an era when materials science was still young, when aluminum alloys were pushed to their limits, the only path to survival was redundancy. Layers of safety, overlapping armor, and forgiving structures that could absorb human error. The Thunderbolt taught an entire generation of designers a lesson that extended far beyond aviation. In bridges, submarines, and even spacecraft, engineers would later repeat the mantra born from wartime necessity: build it to live through the worst. In interviews from the late 1960s, Stevens spoke about the emotional connection that formed between pilot and aircraft. He described how, before every mission, he would run his hand along the cowling of his plane, as if greeting an old friend. "You don't think of it as metal," he said once. "It breathes when the engine turns over." It shakes when it's scared, just like you do. Psychologists studying the phenomenon of anthropomorphism in wartime later cited such behavior as evidence of coping mechanisms. Facing daily mortality, pilots projected human traits onto their machines as a way to manage fear. The aircraft became an emotional companion, a partner in survival. The P-47, with its roaring engine and heavy vibrations, made that illusion even stronger. It was not a quiet plane. It growled, it trembled, it responded physically to every motion. In the noise and vibration, a kind of dialogue emerged, intimate and constant. But there was also a scientific truth hidden within that bond. Pilots who trusted their machines performed better under stress. Their physiological responses, heart rate, oxygen efficiency, reaction time, remained more stable. Trust reduced fear, and reduced fear allowed clearer thinking. Thus, a machine designed for endurance indirectly preserved the endurance of its pilot's mind. In the archives of the U.S. Army Air Force's Medical Corps lies a 1945 report titled * Pilot Stress Response in Extended Combat Missions. * Among its findings was a single remarkable observation. Pilots operating aircraft known for structural reliability demonstrate a 15% reduction in measurable fatigue indicators compared to those operating models with higher mechanical failure rates. In other words, faith in a machine could literally extend a man's life. It is tempting, from the comfort of peace, to see these statistics as mere curiosities. But in the skies over Europe, they were the difference between returning home and vanishing into the clouds. The scientific study of flight stress and aircraft resilience that began with the Thunderbolt eventually evolved into entire fields: human factors engineering, ergonomic design, and systems reliability analysis. Every dial on a modern cockpit, every redundancy in a spacecraft's life support system, carries a trace of those lessons. Behind each switch lies a story written by the men who once fought gravity, flak, and fear in the same breath. By the late 1970s, when aviation had entered the digital age, a few surviving P-47s still flew at airshows. Their deep rumble stood out among the high-pitched whine of jets, a voice from a rougher, louder time. At one such show, Stevens, now grey-haired, wearing civilian clothes, was invited to climb into the cockpit of a restored Thunderbolt. The crowd watched as he ran his hand along the panel, eyes closed, tracing the same rivets he had once known by touch. When the engine roared to life, the old pilot smiled faintly. The owner, a younger aviator born long after the war, later said, he didn't say much. He just listened to the engine like it was speaking to him. What the crowd could not hear were the echoes, the wind over France, the crack of flak, the sound of a machine struggling yet refusing to die. To Stevens, those sounds were not ghosts. They were continuity, proof that what had once been mortal fear had become endurance embodied in aluminum and memory. From a scientific standpoint, the endurance of the P-47 can be explained by equations: load factors, stress tensors, thermodynamic efficiency. But from a human standpoint, it was something simpler. It was faith made mechanical. Every pilot who climbed into that cockpit carried an unspoken belief that the machine beneath him would not give up first. In 1983, at an aerospace symposium, an aging Stevens gave a short lecture titled * Durability as a Design Philosophy to * the audience, mostly engineers accustomed to discussing thrust ratios and composite fatigue, listened as he spoke in quiet, measured tones. Durability, he said, isn't just about material strength. It's about compassion. The designer must imagine the man who will sit inside his creation, not as a test subject, but as a life entrusted to steel and fuel. That understanding is where real engineering begins. The transcript of that talk still circulates in certain academic circles, quoted in textbooks and lectures. It bridges two worlds, the hard realm of physics and the softer realm of empathy. The Thunderbolt stood at that crossroads, proof that machines could carry not just people, but values. In 1991, when Stevens passed away quietly in his sleep, a former student of his placed a small model of a P-47 on his grave. On the underside of its wing was written a single word, *home. And in a sense, that word captured everything the Thunderbolt had ever meant. To the engineers, it was home for their craft, a vessel of precision and power. To the pilots, it was home in the sky, a place of safety in a world of chaos. To history, it became home for a set of principles that outlived the war itself. Build things strong, respect the human life inside them, and never forget that courage is made of both flesh and metal. Even now, long after the roar of radial engines has faded, the echoes of those lessons remain. When a spacecraft enters reentry, when a pilot trusts his instruments in a storm, when a designer double-checks a bolt not for profit but for conscience, all of it traces back to that era, to that philosophy, to that sound of thunder in the clouds. The P-47 Thunderbolt was more than an aircraft. It was a conversation between humanity and its own ingenuity. And as long as that conversation continues, through engineers, through historians, through storytellers, it will never truly fall silent. From an engineering perspective, the P-47 Thunderbolt stood as a paradox. It should not have flown as gracefully as it did. It was enormous by fighter standards, over 8 tons when fully loaded, powered by a 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine that roared like a living storm. Its wing area, fuselage curvature, and weight distribution defied the elegant minimalism of its contemporaries. And yet, through some perfect alchemy of aerodynamics and brute power, it became one of the most effective high-altitude fighters of the war. The secret lay in the physics of airflow and the art of compromise. The Thunderbolt's elliptical wing sections, while thick, generated a steady laminar flow that resisted stall at high angles of attack. Its turbo supercharger, an engineering marvel at the time, allowed the engine to breathe freely at altitudes where thinner air strangled other aircraft. As a result, it could climb higher, dive faster, and sustain energy longer than most of its adversaries. Aerodynamicists at Republic Aviation later described it as a flying pressure vessel, because the fuselage acted as both armor and airframe, a monocoque structure that distributed shockwaves and internal loads across its entire body. When flak or bullets tore into the skin, the energy dispersed rather than concentrated, allowing the aircraft to absorb punishment that would have annihilated lighter planes. The data collected from combat damage reports later formed part of the foundation for modern materials science. Engineers began to understand not only how materials failed, but how they endured. They studied stress propagation, ductility, and impact absorption. The Thunderbolt skin, composed of 24SD aluminum alloy, demonstrated how microcracks could remain stable under cyclic loading, inspiring new research in fatigue resistance. The lessons learned from those studies would one day influence spacecraft hull design, bridge construction, and even biomedical prosthetics. In scientific archives, one can trace a direct lineage, from the P-47's wing spars to the load-bearing ribs of supersonic jets. From its turbo supercharger to the air management systems of modern turbines. From its control redundancy to the fail-safe computers of spacecraft. It was, unknowingly, a prototype for the future. But perhaps its greatest legacy lies not in what it was, but in what it taught. During the late 1940s and early 1950s, researchers began asking a question that went beyond engineering. Why had certain machines, and certain men, survived against all odds? The answer was found in the intersection of psychology, design, and ethics. The P-47 had been built without shortcuts. Every bolt, every bracket, every rivet had been chosen with a margin of safety far greater than necessary. This over-engineering, once criticized as wasteful, turned out to be a moral philosophy in disguise. It represented a belief that life deserved more than efficiency, it deserved assurance. That idea, once embodied in aluminum, would go on to shape entire industries. The Apollo spacecraft, for example, was designed with multiple redundant systems inspired by wartime aircraft philosophy. Never rely on a single point of failure. The same mindset carried into medicine, nuclear safety, and artificial intelligence. In each field, the question remained the same: how much protection does a human life deserve? From a purely mathematical standpoint, the P-47 was a sum of forces: thrust, lift, drag, and weight. But from a human standpoint, it was the embodiment of intention, an act of care rendered in rivets and noise. In the years following the war, physicists and historians sometimes met to discuss the curious harmony between science and storytelling. One of them once remarked, "Every great machine is a biography." The Thunderbolt's biography was written in burnt metal, in the black smoke of dogfights, in the steady hands of engineers who never saw the front lines but fought their own quiet battles in blueprints and drafts. By the time the last operational P-47 was retired, aviation had moved into the jet age. The new generation of aircraft, sleek and supersonic, bore little resemblance to their bulky ancestor. Yet, When test pilots pushed those new machines to their limits, they did so with the same confidence their predecessors had learned in the Thunderbolt. Trust in engineering, trust in endurance. At the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, one restored P-47 sits in silent display, its polished aluminum reflecting the soft glow of ceiling lights. Visitors walk past it without realizing they are standing before the DNA of modern flight. The plaque beneath it lists performance statistics, production numbers, and battle honors, but none of those figures convey the full truth. The truth is that the P-47 was not just built to fight, it was built to survive. And in that survival, it carried forward an unspoken message that still resonates through time, that the strength of any creation is measured not by how fast it can destroy, but by how long it can endure. When we study its blueprints today, we do not merely see a machine, we see the outline of a philosophy, one that unites science with compassion, metal with spirit. The equations of lift and drag tell part of the story, but the rest lives in the hands that built it and the hearts that trusted it. In the hum of engines, in the whir of turbines, in the metallic heartbeat of every aircraft that takes to the sky, there is still a faint echo of the Thunderbolt, a sound that reminds humanity that even in the machinery of war, there can exist a deep, enduring reverence for life itself.